To summarize, both studies show that people are more likely to comply to a larger request only after they've agreed to the initial smaller request. But what if the order of the requests were reversed? Well, that's the focus of the door in the face technique. The door in the face is another two-step compliance technique in which a person is asked an unreasonably large request, but then after asks a smaller, more reasonable request. This causes the individual to be more likely to agree to the small request. This technique relies on reciprocity concession, which is, according to Sanderson and Safdar, when one tries to reciprocate the behaviors of others. In the case of the door in the face technique, one feels compelled to agree to the smaller request because the requester was willing to compromise from their initial larger request. It's also believed that the person feels guilty when they reject the first offer, so to feel less guilty, they comply with the second request. Another possible explanation is the perceptual contrast. Since the second request is more reasonable in contrast to the larger request, the person would be more likely to agree to it. Finally, self-perception also plays a role in that the person accepts the second request to show positive qualities of themselves, like when someone who is kind enough to be open to compromise. Studies done by Patch found that the door in the face technique works best when trying to get people to do pro-social behaviors like charity, since they feel more guilty when they reject the initial request. However, it's not as effective in retail and trade. Caldini and colleagues demonstrate the effects of this technique in their three-part experiment. In the first experiment, there were 3 groups. In the first group, they asked university students if they wanted to become volunteer counselors for juvenile delinquents for 2 hours a week for 2 years, which is a large request. After they refused, they were asked if they could take the delinquents to the zoo for a day, which is a small request. The second group were told the large request, but they were only asked to do the small request, while in the third group, they were only asked the small request. The results showed higher rates of compliance to the second request in the first group, where 50% agreed to do it, while 25% in the second group and 16% in the third group agreed to the second request. This demonstrates that compliance of a small request increases only if the person rejects the large request. The second experiment examined the impact of reciprocity concession on compliance when both requests are asked by different people. In the first and third group, they remained the same as the first experiment. However, in the second group, they had the large and small requests asked by 2 different experimenters. The results showed highest compliance for the small request in the first group, with 55%, and the third group saw 31% compliance. However, in the second group, with the 2 experimenters, only 10.5% agreed to the small request. This demonstrates that reciprocity concession does not apply when a person asks a small request. In the third experiment, they examined the effects of reciprocity when asking 2 equivalent requests. Both group 1 and 3 remained the same. However, in group 2, the experimenter asked 2 equivalent requests. So they would ask first if they could take the delinquents to the museum for a couple of hours, then ask if they could take the delinquents to the zoo for a couple of hours. Again, the results showed compliance highest in the first group with 54.1%. However, in both groups 2 and 3, they saw 33% compliance to the small request. This demonstrates the size of the request is relevant to compliance, and that the second request must be smaller in comparison to the first request. One of the strengths of the study is that the subjects were randomly selected, which increases internal validity. Another strength is that the study was conducted in multiple experiments to demonstrate the different aspects of the door in the face technique. The first experiment indicated the rejection of the large request was important for compliance to the small request. The second experiment indicates the impact of reciprocity concession. The third experiment demonstrates that the size of the request is important as well. They also acknowledge that social norms may also impact how one reacts to this technique. A limitation of the study is that the sample size in each experiment, which decreases the external validity. Another limitation is that in the second experiment, all 58 subjects that were used were male, which could have resulted in a gender bias. However, in the other experiments, both sexes were used. Also, the study was not on university students, which makes one question if you could apply to the lay population. Both techniques of the foot in the door and the door in the face are important concepts, since it allows for one to be more aware of these techniques when they're being used on them, which can help them critically assess the situation before making a decision. But how effective is one technique over the other? Well, that will be the next focus of this video.
Created using Powtoon.